It was just after the founding of heaven, for that first time when the 9 worlds were full wrought. And Odin, master of the gods, looked with his 2 great blue jewel eyes upon creation, and stood with the only one of his brethren, the Aesir, Mimir, who it was said was mortal. And it was true, although Mimir growed with a wisdom that grew like a great yew tree, his body grew old and uncertain, and one day men whispered he may die. But Odin did not think of that. Rather, he looked in joy at his new dominion. It was true, the 3 giant maids had come recently and sat up by the well under the great boughs of the yew, upon which the foundations of the world were set. And they had begun to weave fates, Mimir said, and would say no more. So Odin, taking Mimir with him, although Mimir said, we should go and leave them be, bright Odin in his youth decided to see, if he might, how many skeins of fate the Norns had, to know his time. And so he climbed up a branch, and as he climbed up a branch, as heavy was he, and the first branches of the tree of the yew were uncertain, and a branch broke off and hit Mimir on the forehead. You all right, old fellow? And Mimir said, yes, but come down. But Odin went slightly higher, and he looked then upon the 9 worlds, and he saw they were lovely. And then he looked down at the Norns, and he could see they were weaving, but he could not quite make out the numbers of the skeins of fate. It could be very many. It could be very few. And he craned over, but he couldn't see. And then suddenly he looked up, and for the very first time, from that height, high above all of heaven, he looked east, beyond the land of trolls. And what do you think he saw there? But that some other race of gods had built their world abutting his, so that there was no line between them. Indeed, as he watched, some mighty stinking troll crossed between their fey land and his. And then he looked further at the halls of their gods, and he shook his fist at them, saying to himself and aloud, with a voice that rang to the east, how dare you build your world so close to mine? And as he watched, the mightiest of their gods shook a spear back at him. Well, in hot anger, and ignoring all Mimir's pleas, Odin called a great council. There was Thor, his beloved son, and there was his wife and all the Valkyrie, and they all decided the only course was war, to rend those gods and force them to build their world somewhere else. And so the Aesir crossed to the east, in the full glory of their youth, in the full power of their war, a mighty host, recruiting what elves they could, and even more what trolls and giants would follow in their wake. And it was said in those days, even certain Thrym came upon that campaign, knowing they could get spoils from such a war. And so it was, the mighty host came to the halls of the east, and crossed over to the land of the Vanir, and that they lay a waste for all the fey glamour and all the fey power. They dragged down their rainbows, and from their light would form a rainbow of their own, holy Bifrost. They desecrated their wells. They destroyed their halls, coming at last to that very central city, high in the dominion that Odin had seen. And then, before he sacked it, he called upon the Vanir to parley. And the Vanir sent out their mightiest witch, and she stood before them and said, you are right. We are as a people beaten, and as a person beaten, I will meet you in your own halls. And Odin said, Well, we will set guard here, the giants may stay, and the trolls, and we will go back to our own halls. And there you must agree to parley upon your life. And she smiled and said, upon my life I will parley with you there. And leaving then all the giants and the trolls, guarding as it were the lands of the Fae, and what dogs he had, barking, Odin marched back to the halls of Asgard. And Glansheim shone under the glory of his host, and by his side he had Mimir, who had always looked uncertain, Thor his son, and the beautiful champion Hrym. Now Hrym was the bravest and the most beautifulest of the gods, but the stupidest. He had no mind. Odin had already thought he's a bit like a Vanir that way. He has no thoughts of his own. And he came then to his hall, and there was the witch before him, and she smiled and said, it is true, you have beaten us. What would you have? And Odin said, well, you fought well. All I would have is you take your lands away from ours. Build your world somewhere else, nowhere near mine. And she smiled and said, maybe. And in that smile, suddenly there shot from her mouth a spark, and the spark seemed to kindle somewhere up in the rafters. Fanny looked up, and he saw the spark was making the golden thatch glow, and he shouted, she's a witch! Before anyone could stop him, the beautiful Hrym had thrown a spear and caught the witch in her throat, and she seemed to dissolve into nothing. But from her form shifted a grey cat. That they lunged at and was gone, but soon the holy thatch of their great hall, Valhalla, was burning. And then the great gods struggled to get water from their wells. But just at that moment, Heimdall called, the walls! The walls! The giants and the Fae are here! And ran out as hard as they could, and it was true. The very shield wall of heaven was assailed, and assailed again by the fierce Thane, and they started to break through, and again the gods threw them back and threw them back, and they were pushed to their very extreme, the hardest they'd ever had to fight. While behind them, Frigg put out the halls that had been ablaze, using all the water that the gods had in their own halls. And just as the gods started to triumph and to throw the Vanir back, the cat appeared again. And before they could stop it, it had opened up a little portal gate in heaven. And through it there stepped a mighty champion, known in after days as Frey, and with him a great sword. And he threw Odin back, and Hugin, who came to assail him, the cat is with him. He is immortal. And so Thor took his hammer and he threw it at the cat, and its head splattered everywhere. It seemed as dead, but from its spirit there flew a swallow high into the air, where none could stop it. And Odin said to Mimir, follow that swallow. And the gods and the Vane once again struggled there on the very walls of heaven. And the Vane, although they were forced back, started to set a blaze upon the shield wall and the plank wall. And the ironwood started to burn so that even the gods could not bear it. Meanwhile, Mimir followed the swallow. And seeing it at last high in the heavens, nearest the sun, he took a great bow and shot it. And the arrow went through its heart, but it fell down like a spark, like the spark of the sun. It seemed indeed to bring the very fire of the sun down into heaven, and Asgard once again exploded in flame from the great halls of the gods. And then Mimir, in terror, went up to Urd, to that well by which the one tree that holds together the 9 worlds is watered. And he took then all the bucket he could and threw it down the hill. And with the holy water, the water of life itself, which would ever be depleted, he put out the thatch on the fire of the halls of the gods. And as that fire died, it was like all fury died. The Vanir and the Aesir, the Fae and the gods, looked at each other in the middle of their fight, and they threw down their weapons in disgust. And Odin gripped the greatest of the Vanir and said, "Why are we fighting? I have forgotten." And the Vain said, "We do not know, remember. For all our halls are burnt, and now all yours are. And only the dogs howl, picking the bodies of the dead." And Odin said, "Shall we have peace?" And they went then to the burned halls. They mourned. And before them, there came the witch again. And she said, "As the dogs barked and I was shot from the sky, as my fierce flame was put out, so I long no more for war." And the gods then, and the Fae, feasted long, for centuries perhaps, and swore eternal peace, spitting out their promise on the land. And that promise of peace in the heavens, became its own story. But the gods agreed to exchange hostage with the Vain in a year and a day, and so swear their holy peace.